What if I told you the way you eat pizza, enjoy your morning coffee, or even snack on popcorn has roots thousands of years old, in societies long before Columbus? Prepare to have your mind blown as we uncover the pre-Columbian agricultural secrets that literally shaped your dinner plate today. Welcome to our world of discovery and adventure. This channel is all about exploring the unknown, explaining the incredible, and revealing the truth behind the most fascinating topics on Earth. If you love learning something new every day, you're in the right place. Now we explain pre-Columbian agricultural innovations that shaped modern food. Before the rise of vast empires, before Spanish chroniclers stepped ashore with their steel, their diseases, and their ravenous hunger for new dominions, the American continents were already alive with a quiet revolution, one written not with armies and monuments, but with seeds, soils, and the intimate intelligence of human hands. The story of pre-Columbian agriculture is often overshadowed by the clash of civilizations that came later. Yet this earlier epic shaped the food we eat today more deeply than any other. To understand the world's kitchens, the spices, the staples, the vegetables, the sauces, we must journey back to the beginning, long before there was a Europe to discover in America, and long before any chronicler thought the land worth writing about. This world was vast and varied. It stretched from the frozen tundra of the Arctic tribes to the humid, jungle-thick cradle of the Maya, down the jagged spine of the Andes, and across the rolling plains where nomadic groups followed bison herds. But at the center of the story is a quieter, subtler drama, how communities coaxed life from the soil and transformed wild plants into the ancestors of the foods that now fill supermarket shelves. The people of these lands were not simply hunters or gatherers. They were scientists, experimenters, and observers whose laboratories were forests, valleys, and mountains, and whose findings would endure for millennia. The ancient agriculturalists of the Americas had no written textbooks to consult. Their knowledge came from observing the shape of a riverbank, the timing of a rainy season, the tendency of a plant to grow taller in one soil than another. They learned by watching how wind shaped corn tassels, how shade protected tender cacao seedlings, and how fire could reset a landscape and prepare it for a new cycle of growth. The oldest stories tell of knowledge passed between generations, not as rigid doctrine, but as living memory, memory embedded in practice, in ritual, in dance, in food. Long before there were cities, the people who would one day build them were learning to tame plants. The wild ancestors of corn were scarcely edible grasses, hardly recognizable to the world's most iconic cereal today. Potatoes were poisonous tubers hiding beneath the frost-bitten earth. Tomatoes were bitter, berry-sized fruits growing on creeping vines. And cacao, destined to become the world's obsession, existed only as an unnoticed pod deep in the understory of the tropical rainforest. Each of these plants needed transformation, slow, patient, observational transformation before becoming food worthy of civilizations. But this first chapter is not just about plants. It is also about people, how they lived, how they learned, how they transformed themselves along with their crops. To understand the agricultural innovations that shaped modern food, we must begin by stepping into a world where every harvest was an act of faith, every new seedling an uncertain experiment, and every field a testament to human adaptability. As the last ice age receded, people across the Americas adapted to new climates that emerged around them. The megafauna, mammoths, giant ground sloths, ancient bison, were disappearing, forcing communities to rely less on large game and more on the dependable bounty of smaller animals and edible plants. This shift did not happen suddenly. It was gradual, unfolding over generations. People noted which plants returned each year, which ones withstood weather extremes, which ones attracted birds or resisted pests. They began planting seeds intentionally, first casually, then systematically, and eventually with precision.
One of the earliest regions to exhibit this shift was Mesoamerica, a long arc of land stretching from central Mexico to the northern reaches of modern-day Costa Rica. Here, the humidity, rainfall, and ecological diversity created a natural greenhouse for agricultural experimentation. Wild grasses like teosinte, small and unassuming, grew in abundance on valley floors. Groups of early cultivators noticed that certain stalks produced slightly fuller kernels. A family might collect those kernels for future seasons, unwittingly beginning a process of selective breeding. Over many generations, teosinte's tough casing softened, its kernels multiplied, and its stature changed, eventually giving rise to maize, the foundation upon which entire civilizations would stand. Meanwhile, deep in the Andean highlands, another drama was unfolding, thousands of miles away, but with striking parallels. The people here, living at dizzying altitudes among cloud-kissed peaks, discovered that frost-resistant tubers grew better than delicate grains. Potatoes, in their wild form, were bitter and often toxic, requiring careful preparation to become edible. And yet, the Andean people saw potential. They discovered that certain varieties survived better in higher soils. Others stored more starch. Still others reacted favorably when exposed to the cold night air. Over centuries, they developed not just one potato, but thousands of varieties. Small ones, long ones, purple ones, waxy ones, flowery ones, each suited to its microclimate. They learned to freeze-dry them naturally, using the dramatic swings between day and night, creating chuño, a lightweight, shelf-stable food that could last years. These early experiments were not lone endeavors. They were sustained by communities, and communities themselves began to shift as agriculture took root. No longer did people need to move constantly in search of food. Villages formed, roles diversified. Some people became seed specialists, others became builders, potters, or spiritual guides. Rituals emerged honoring the earth and the deities believed to govern growth and fertility. Stories were told of corn maidens, rain gods, serpent spirits who guarded seeds, and sun deities who ensured the turning of seasons.
The rise of stable settlements gave way to even larger transformations. Irrigation became a necessity in regions where rainfall was unreliable. Communities in the deserts of the American Southwest dug intricate canal systems, some stretching miles, channeling river water into fields of maize, beans, and squash. Their canals, built with nothing more than wooden tools and the guidance of observation, rivaled some of the earliest irrigation systems known to humanity. Farther south, in Mesoamerica, farmers built chinampas, floating gardens anchored in shallow lakes. These were engineered marvels, rectangular plots formed by piling mud and organic material atop a framework of reeds. They produced food year-round, resisting drought and allowing unprecedented yields. To this day, the remnants of chinampas near Mexico City continue to grow produce in a way that is both ancient and sustainable. Agriculture was more than food. It was identity. Entire cultures shaped their myths, daily routines, and political systems around what they grew. The Maya charted the stars not just out of curiosity, but to track planting and harvesting seasons. The Inca built administrative centers to oversee potato fields and terraces carved into mountainsides like steps made for giants. These terraces were architectural masterpieces that mastered microclimates, allowing crops to grow at elevations where nature alone would not permit them. The terraces also prevented erosion, conserved water, and stabilized slopes vulnerable to landslides. But to understand how deeply intertwined agriculture and identity were, one must look at the people and their rituals. In the Maya world, the planting of maize was accompanied by ceremony and song. Priests invoked deities to bless the soil. Families gathered to thank the spirits of the land. Every kernel planted was seen as both a practical act and a sacred offering. The process of harvesting was equally ceremonial. It reaffirmed community bonds and the belief that humans in nature were partners rather than adversaries. In the Andean world, the potato was not merely a crop, but a companion. Families kept small baskets of potatoes as offerings to household spirits. Special varieties were used in rituals, weddings, and festivals. And every planting season, communities gathered to bless the fields, sprinkling chicha, fermented maize beer, into the earth as a token of gratitude. When a harvest survived frost, hail, or drought, songs of thanks echoed across stone terraces. When it failed, as occasionally happened, communities held ceremonies to ask forgiveness or seek guidance. Meanwhile, in the tropical lowlands of South America, another plant was undergoing transformation: cassava. This hardy root grew in poor soils, resisting drought and pests where more delicate crops would wither. Cassava came in two forms, sweet and bitter, but the bitter variety contains cyanogenic compounds. Consuming it without proper processing could be deadly. Yet communities learned to detoxify it, grating, soaking, fermenting, pressing, and roasting it until it became safe, nutritious, and versatile. Cassava flour would feed millions long before wheat flour arrived from Europe.
Agriculture also shaped political landscapes. Surpluses of food allowed larger populations to gather, leading to the rise of city-states, chiefdoms, and eventually empires. Maize, beans, squash, potatoes, cacao, quinoa, chili peppers, tomatoes, peanuts, and countless other crops enabled societies to grow in complexity. Markets emerged. Roads connected distant communities. Traders carried seeds, stories, and innovations across vast distances, facilitating a network of agricultural knowledge that spanned thousands of miles. But agriculture also demanded new forms of organization. Someone needed to decide when fields should be planted, when canals should be cleared, and which varieties should be preserved for future seasons. Elders, keepers of agricultural knowledge, became crucial. Their wisdom guided planting cycles, determined which rituals ensured balance, and maintained seed diversity. Some communities even designated fields specifically for experimentation, testing new combinations of plants and monitoring their resilience. This era was marked by collaboration, resilience, and creativity. Nothing was static. The people of the Americas were constantly adapting to new climates, new diseases, new pressures, and new opportunities. Through careful observation, trial and error, and a deep relationship with the natural world, they created an agricultural legacy unmatched in diversity. The rise of agriculture across the pre-Columbian Americas did not merely create food. It sculpted civilizations. It shaped belief systems, political hierarchies, astronomical observations, trade routes, architecture, and even warfare. The first kernels of maize and the earliest tended potato fields did more than sustain stomachs. They fueled minds, ambitions, and systems of order. When people first settled into communities reliant on stable crops, a fundamental shift occurred. Time itself needed to be measured. Hunters could afford to operate on instinct, following migrations and seasonal cues, but farmers needed precision. The Maya understood this deeply. Their environment, the lush but unpredictable rainforest, demanded meticulous tracking of rain cycles, river swelling, and the movements of the stars. They built complex calendars not simply out of intellectual curiosity, but because the success of maize planting depended on celestial timing. A single miscalculation meant an entire year of lost harvest, famine, or social collapse. In the vibrant Maya lowlands, agriculture became the ordering principle of society. Priests tracked Venus across the sky to determine when to begin clearing the fields. Ritual specialists interpreted omens carried by birds and insects. Farmers coordinated planting in great communal labor groups, each person contributing to the work that sustained the collective. A village did not survive on individual effort, but on the harmonious choreography of its people. Ceremonies marked every phase, from the first clearing of land to the final harvest. Smoke from burning copal resin drifted skyward as offerings were made to deities believed to dwell in the mountains, clouds, and underworld rivers. The Maya world, though dominated by its mighty cities, Tikal, Palenque, Copan, was fundamentally rural. The true power lay not in stone pyramids, but in the impeccable management of farmland. In many ways, the Maya were innovators of ecological balance. They mastered raised fields, diversified plantings, and even integrated forest gardening. Their fields formed mosaics of maize stalks, climbing bean vines, flowering squash plants, and fruit trees overhead. This polyculture reduced pests, enriched the soil, and sustained nutrition. It also mirrored their worldview, which valued synergy between all living things. Far to the south, the Inca Empire was rising toward a very different, yet equally sophisticated agricultural model. Their lands were challenging: razor-edge mountains, icy nights, and thin oxygen. Yet they turned the Andes into a tapestry of productivity. Terraces transformed mountainsides into layered gardens, each level capturing sunlight differently, each producing specific crops adapted to its altitude. Some terraces basked in warmth suitable for maize, while others higher up were devoted to tubers and quinoa. The Incas understood microclimates with astonishing nuance. At the heart of their agricultural system was a combination of science and spirituality. The Inca ruler, the Sapa Inca, was considered a child of the sun. In agriculture was his link between divine power and earthly duty. State storehouses kept vast reserves of crops, carefully dried, sealed, and categorized. These reserves were insurance against famine, war, or natural catastrophe. Roads stretching thousands of kilometers connected these storehouses, ensuring that no community remained isolated in times of need. Yet the Inca did not simply grow crops. They engineered entire landscapes. They built canals that ran like arteries across valleys, transporting glacial water into fields. They created sunken gardens in coastal regions to capture moisture from fog. They domesticated crops with precision unmatched by many ancient civilizations. Their agricultural diversity was staggering. Over 3,000 potatoes, hundreds of maize varieties, dozens of quinoa types, and countless medicinal plants. But what is most remarkable is how agricultural knowledge was shared. The Incas developed institutions for teaching farmers new methods. Specialists traveled from region to region, instructing local communities in terrace repair, seed selection, and storage techniques. Knowledge flowed continuously across the empire, adapted to each region's needs. Meanwhile, in the North American Southwest, home to the Hohokam, Mogollon, and ancestral Puebloans, another agricultural marvel flourished. Here, the environment was unforgiving, dry, sun-scorched, and unpredictable. Yet the Hohokam built sophisticated irrigation systems rivaling those of ancient Mesopotamia. Their canals sometimes spanned more than 20 kilometers. They directed water with precision, carving desert landscapes into life-giving oases. Maize, beans, and squash, often called the Three Sisters, were the core of their diet. But the genius of the Three Sisters lay in the way they grew together. Maize provided a tall structure, beans climbed the maize, fixing nitrogen into the soil. Squash spread broad leaves across the ground, suppressing weeds and conserving moisture. This harmonious planting was not merely practical, it was ecological engineering. Indigenous farmers understood long before modern science that harmony between crops created abundance. Across the Amazon basin, agriculture took an entirely different form, one hidden in the forest and only recently understood by archaeologists. The people here did not clear massive fields. Instead, they sculpted the forest into gardens. They enriched the soil using charcoal, bone, and organic matter to create terra preta, dark earth. This soil was incredibly fertile, resistant to nutrient leaching even in heavy rain. It allowed dense populations to thrive where outsiders once believed no civilization could. The forest itself became a form of agriculture, filled with orchards of Brazil nuts, cacao, peach palms, and medicinal plants.
To walk through an Amazonian forest of 1,000 years ago was to walk through a garden, the one disguised as wild nature.
These agricultural innovations also shaped trade. Seeds became treasures, exchanged across vast distances. Maize varieties traveled from Mexico to the Canadian plains. Sweet potatoes journeyed by sea all the way to Polynesia long before European ships crossed the Pacific. Chili peppers migrated from Mesoamerica to South America, then outward to the Caribbean. What resulted was a continental web of exchange. Ideas, seeds, and techniques moving between cultures, enriching everyone. As societies grew more complex, so too did their agricultural challenges. Pests threatened fields, weather patterns shifted. Some regions experienced drought that lasted generations. But these societies adapted through ingenious solutions: floodplain farming, drought-resistant crops, seed banks, and ritual practices meant to maintain harmony with nature. Whether the rituals had measurable effects didn't matter. Community cohesion did. Unity ensured labor was available to restore damaged terraces or repair irrigation works. One of the most extraordinary agricultural systems developed during this era was the Chinampa system in central Mexico. The Aztecs perfected these floating gardens on the shallow lakes surrounding their capital, Tenochtitlan. Chinampas were rectangles of woven reeds stacked with mud and compost until they rose slightly above the waterline. They produced astonishing yields, sometimes up to 7 harvests a year. Farmers could plant maize, amaranth, beans, squash, tomatoes, onions, and herbs in rapid cycles. Trees like willows were planted at the corners to anchor the structure, their roots weaving into the structure. The lakes acted as natural regulators of temperature and moisture. Even during droughts, Chinampas thrived. And because the channels between them acted as waterways, fishermen and canoe travel integrated seamlessly with agriculture. The entire basin became a living machine, a fusion of engineering, ecology, and daily life. Yet Chinampas were more than farming tools. They were mirrors of Aztec cosmology. To the Aztec mind, the world was divided into layers: earth, water, and sky. And the Chinampa sat precisely at the intersection. They represented the harmonious balance between human innovation and the natural world. Farmers tended them with reverence. Each planting season involved rituals honoring Tlaloc, the rain god, and Totec, the deity of renewal. While central Mexico mastered Chinampas, the Caribbean islands developed agricultural practices suited to their unique environment. Taino communities cultivated cassava in mounded fields called canucos. These mounds improved drainage and soil aeration, essential in tropical regions with heavy rainfall. Cassava was processed into flatbreads that became daily sustenance. It stored well, resisted spoilage, and supported large populations.
Throughout the Caribbean, crops traveled between islands on canoes, navigating turquoise waters. Sweet potatoes, peanuts, chili peppers, and maize formed an oceanic network of flavors and cultural exchange. The Taino worldview tied agriculture to ancestry. Spirits of the dead were believed to dwell in caves and mountains, blessing the fields and guiding growth. Every harvest was a conversation with the past and a promise for the future. But no crop shaped the pre-Columbian Americas or the world quite like maize. By the time of the great civilizations, maize had diversified into an astonishing array. Some varieties were small and sweet, others tall and starchy, others deep blue or bright red. Farmers engineered maize to grow in deserts, mountains, jungles, and temperate plains. It became not just a food, but a metaphor. In Maya mythology, humans were made for maize. In many regions, newborns received maize water during naming ceremonies. Maize was life itself. In the Andes, potatoes held a similar status. Families preserved hundreds of potato varieties in small personal seed collections. Terraces allowed potatoes and quinoa to flourish where grain-based civilizations would have starved. The Incas built freeze-drying into their survival systems, knowing that strategic storage meant security for their vast empire. Chuño fed armies, supported long journeys, and sustained high-altitude communities through harsh winters. Agriculture also influenced power. Rulers who controlled water controlled life. In areas like the coast of Peru, irrigation networks were the lifeblood of kingdoms. Whoever organized labor to maintain canals gained political legitimacy. Priests declared festivals aligned with planting cycles to maintain cosmic order and harvest abundance. Warriors protected storage houses that held seeds for the next generation. But perhaps the most important agricultural legacy of pre-Columbian America was experimentation. These societies never stopped innovating. They tested new crop combinations, studied soil responses, and tracked seasonal variations. They bred crops based on color, taste, storage ability, medicinal value, and spiritual significance. Their knowledge was accumulated through centuries of observation and passed down not through written texts, but through practice, song, and ritual.
The rise of large-scale civilizations in the Americas was inseparable from the agricultural foundations laid by generations of observers, experimenters, and farmers who had coaxed possibility from the land. By the time the great empires emerged, the Maya with their astronomical cities, the Aztecs with their floating metropolis of Tenochtitlan, and the Inca with their mountain-spanning domains, the agricultural traditions of earlier centuries had matured into a complex, almost scientific mastery of Earth's resources. These societies rose not just because they built monuments or waged wars, but because their food systems were strong enough to sustain millions, bind diverse regions, and support specialized classes of artisans, scholars, priests, and rulers. Part 3 of this story explores how agriculture became the engine of empire, how food became ideology, and how seeds became instruments of power. Long before steel or horses arrived in the Americas, the Aztecs wielded maize the way other empires wielded gold. Their entire civilization was woven around it. Every household, from the humblest hut to the grandest temple, depended on its steady supply. But maize was not merely a crop, it was a deity, a creator, a sustainer. In Aztec cosmology, humans were fashioned from maize dough after earlier attempts to shape humanity had failed. Maize was life itself, and so controlling its production meant controlling society's very bloodline. The Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, rose from the waters of Lake Texcoco like a jewel set atop silver. Its floating gardens, chinampas, produced a constant flood of crops that kept its markets overflowing. But this agricultural abundance required extraordinary organization. Workers maintained canals, tended to the dikes that controlled water movement, dredged nutrient-rich mud from the lakebed, and replanted crops in regular cycles. Markets thrived because food was so abundant that it became a form of wealth. Merchants traded not only produce, but also cacao beans, chili peppers, squash, and amaranth flour. A visitor walking through the bustling marketplace of Tlatelolco might see rows of maize cake stocked like treasure, baskets of glistening tomatoes arranged like rubies, and chili peppers so red they seem to glow under the sun. Across the continent, in the high Andes, the Inca Empire was forging an agricultural system that remains one of the most sophisticated ever created. Their empire spread along the backbone of South America, from modern Colombia to northern Chile and Argentina. The terrain was brutal, towering mountains, icy winds, unpredictable weather. But the Inca turned adversity into advantage. Instead of fighting the landscape, they engineered it. Terraces carved into mountainsides rose in steps, each one designed to create a specific microclimate. Higher terraces cooled at night more quickly, suitable for frost-resistant potato varieties. Middle terraces provided just the right conditions for quinoa, maize, amaranth, and beans. Lower terraces closer to valleys hosted fruit trees and warmer weather crops.
These terraces transformed impossible land into steady sources of food. The stone retaining walls absorbed sunlight during the day and released it at night, protecting crops from frost. Irrigation canals carried glacial meltwater down the mountainsides, providing consistent hydration that no single rainy season could guarantee. In some regions, canals snaked hundreds of miles, crossing valleys and feeding entire communities. The Inca did not simply grow food, they created agricultural landscapes that functioned as living machines. But the Inca were not alone in their innovations. The Maya, though past their classical peak by the time of Inca and Aztec expansion, still maintained complex agricultural systems that had supported their earlier cities. They mastered forest gardening, a practice in which farmers cultivated multi-layered ecosystems. Instead of clearing forests entirely, they shaped them. Tall trees provided shade and moderated humidity. Mid-layer cacao trees thrived beneath them. Ground-level plants like chili peppers, squash, and medicinal herbs filled in the lower spaces. This was agriculture that mimicked nature, ensuring soil health, biodiversity, and resilience. Despite their accomplishments, the Maya faced challenges. Their heartlands in the Yucatan Peninsula had few rivers, and rainfall was seasonal. To survive, they built reservoirs, dug choltons, bottle-shaped cisterns, and created intricate systems to capture and store every possible drop of rainwater. Their survival depended on the intelligent management of scarcity. Entire cities were planned around water retention. The Maya knew that without water, no crop, no matter how resilient, could flourish. What united these civilizations was their reliance on agricultural innovation to sustain political power. Food-fed armies, supported massive building projects, and reinforced systems of tribute. Conquered regions paid taxes not in coins, but in crops. The Aztec Empire demanded maize, cacao, and cotton from subject towns. The Inca required potatoes, quinoa, and llama wool. The Maya demanded chili peppers, honey, salt, and other necessities. Tribute systems became the arteries of empire, coursing with food from distant regions toward imperial centers. Yet political power came not only from collecting food, but also from managing its distribution. The Inca operated vast state storehouses, kulkas, located strategically throughout their empire. These storehouses held dried potatoes, tuño, freeze-dried meat, charqui, maize, quinoa, beans, dried fruits, and medicinal plants. Some of these foods could be stored for years without spoiling. This allowed the Inca to feed their armies, buffer famines, and maintain a sense of security unmatched by many societies of the ancient world. Roads connected one storehouse to another. Runners carried messages ensuring supply and demand were balanced. The Inca Empire ran like a circulatory system whose heartbeat was agriculture. In the Aztec world, food also played a central ideological role. The god Huitzilopochtli demanded offerings that symbolized nourishment, for his survival ensured the sun's movement across the sky. Food was offered in rituals. Food was exchanged as gifts. Food structured social hierarchies. Nobles eat elaborately spiced dishes rich with turkey, rabbit, or ducks, while commoners subsisted largely on maize, beans, and squash. But this was not seen as deprivation. Maize was sacred. Beans and squash complemented it nutritionally. Together, they provided complete proteins and sustained incredible physical labor. The milpa, an agricultural field planted with maize, beans, squash, and sometimes chile, was both a physical and philosophical symbol of harmony. Each plant nourished the others. Beans fixed nitrogen, squash shaded the soil, maize provided structure. The milpa system was a triumph of ecological understanding. No monocultures, no vast single-crop fields, no risk of soil depletion. Instead, the milpa embodied diversity and sustainability. It produced abundant yields while restoring soil fertility each year. Modern agricultural scientists still admire it as one of the world's most efficient food systems. But it was the Inca who pushed agriculture to its absolute limits. Their empire crossed altitudes that few other civilizations dared inhabit. They created experimental agricultural stations like morai, a series of circular terraces descending like an amphitheater into the earth.
Temperatures could vary as much as 15 degrees Celsius from top to bottom, creating zones that mirrored different climates across their empire. Moray was not a farm, it was a laboratory. Here, the Inca tested which crops grew best at which conditions, how maize responded to different soil compositions, how quinoa tolerated shifts in humidity, and how potatoes adapted to colder nights. Their understanding of plant adaptation rivaled some early modern agricultural research, and it was conducted without written language or steel tools. At the same time, the people of the Amazon basin, though not empire builders in the same sense, carried out agricultural innovations arguably more surprising. They created terra preta, a fertile black soil enriched with charcoal, fish bones, pottery shards, plant remains, and organic wastes. This soil regenerated itself and could maintain nutrients for thousands of years. In a region where most soil was naturally poor, terra preta allowed the growth of crops that otherwise would not thrive. Scholars now believe vast portions of the Amazon were not untouched wilderness, but a carefully managed mosaic of agricultural and forested zones. This agricultural abundance supported dense populations that astonished early European observers. Some Amazonian settlements may have held tens of thousands of people. These were not random jungle dwellers, they were agricultural strategists who shaped the rainforest through controlled burns, selective pruning, and soil engineering. Their approach was not large-scale terrace construction like the Andes, but a subtle reshaping of ecosystems, a distributed, sustainable form of agriculture integrated into the forest itself.
Food was also deeply tied to ritual life throughout the Americas. In the Maya world, cacao was essential for ceremonies. Priests consumed it during rituals, rulers offered it to gods, elites used it to seal political alliances. Cacao beans became currency, portable, valuable, symbolic. But cacao was not grown everywhere. It required warm, humid lowlands. Thus, trade routes linked highlands to lowlands, creating economic networks that bound distant regions together. A ruler in a highland Maya city might depend on the labor of lowland farmers hundreds of miles away. In the Aztec world, feasting was a political tool. The emperor hosted massive banquets for nobles and ambassadors, displaying the empire's wealth through food variety. Hundreds of dishes might appear in a single event. Turkey stews thickened with pumpkin seeds, tamales filled with squash blossoms, sauces infused with chili peppers and tomatoes, drinks flavored with vanilla or honey. Food was diplomacy. Food was theater. Food proclaimed imperial power. Even warfare was influenced by agriculture. Armies needed reliable provisions. Portable foods like maize cakes, dried meat, and ground amaranth sustained soldiers on long campaigns. For the Inca, state storehouses ensured that troops marching across the mountains never lacked nourishment. This allowed the Inca to conquer regions thousands of miles from their origin. Their empire grew not only through military force, but also through superior logistics built on agricultural planning. As populations expanded and cities grew, ecological pressures emerged. Some regions became overfarmed, others faced drought. Still others had to intensify production to meet tribute demands. This pushed societies to innovate further, building new terraces, expanding irrigation networks, experimenting with new crop varieties, and even altering social structures to ensure more labor was available for farming. Agricultural labor was sacred duty. In the Inca Empire, communities owed the state a portion of their time, working fields that produced food for armies, festivals, or redistribution. In Aztec society, communal fields supported temples, schools, and leadership. The intimate relationship between people and food shaped social norms. Marriages, festivals, births, and funerals all included agricultural rituals. Planting seasons determined local calendars. Farmers consulted astronomical observations to know when to sow and harvest. The Pleiades constellation signaled rainfall for Andean farmers. Maya astronomers tracked Venus and the sun to create planting almanacs. Agriculture was not separate from science. It was the reason science existed.
By the height of these civilizations, just before European arrival, the Americas had become a world of extraordinary agricultural complexity. More than half of the foods that today feed the world originated in these lands. Potatoes, maize, tomatoes, peppers, squash, cacao, peanuts, pineapples, avocados, cassava, quinoa, vanilla, and more. Entire cuisines across continents, Italian, Indian, Chinese, West African, would one day be transformed by these crops. Yet at this moment in history, they were still largely local treasures. What these societies achieved stands among humanity's greatest accomplishments. They fed empires without draft animals, without plows, without metal tools. They domesticated hundreds of plant species. They built food systems that were sustainable, diverse, resilient, and deeply integrated into culture. They showed that agriculture was not simply labor, but knowledge, spirituality, science, and power. The rise of great pre-Columbian civilizations did not emerge from vast armies or sweeping conquests alone, but from something far quieter. Fields, canals, terraces, orchards, and seed archives woven into the daily labor of farmers who rarely appeared in codices or chronicles. In these lands, agricultural engineering became political strategy, and food production became the foundation of governance. Each seed sown represented not only nourishment, but legitimacy, stability, and a relationship between rulers and ruled. Across the central Mexican highlands, the Aztec Empire rose like a shimmering mirage above the waters of Lake Texcoco. Tenochtitlan, built on islands and connected by causeways, required a hydraulic and agricultural system capable of sustaining hundreds of thousands of people. The city was dazzling, markets bustling with vendors selling maize tamales, cacao drinks, chili pastes, amaranth cakes, squash blossoms, and fresh produce grown nearby. Yet none of this would have been possible without the Chinapa system that extended far into the shallow lakes like vast green carpets floating on water. These Chinapas were masterpieces of ecological engineering. Farmers dug mud from the lake bottom, mixed it with decaying vegetation, and built rectangular platforms reinforced with willow trees. Each Chinampa recycled nutrients continuously as water filtered through its porous edges. It was a landscape that renewed itself. But it was also a political landscape. The Aztecs assigned Chinampa plots to families under strict rules. Farmers were obligated to maintain canals, dredge sediments, plant trees to stabilize edges, and deliver portions of produce as tribute. Tribute lists carved into stone and painted onto codices reveal astonishing detail. Peppers, tomatoes, avocados, beans, maize, chia seeds, amaranth, flowers, cotton. Every region contributed what it grew best. As the empire expanded, its leaders strategically absorbed fertile lands where tribute could be collected efficiently. The expansion of the empire was in many ways the expansion of its agricultural tax base. Yet the Aztecs were not the only ones turning landscapes into political machines. Deep in the Andes, the Inca Empire carved terraces into mountainsides with such precision that modern engineers still marvel at their design. These terraces were not simply stocked plots of land. Each was a carefully engineered microclimate. Soil from lower valleys was transported upward, layer upon layer, combined with gravel and sand to regulate drainage. Higher terraces supported frost-resistant potatoes and quinoa. Mid-level terraces grew maize. Lower terraces produced squash, beans, and fruits. Terracing was more than an agricultural innovation. It was a message. Every new terrace proclaimed the power of the state to control land and climate. The Inca rulers oversaw a sophisticated labor institution known as mita, in which communities contributed work to imperial projects. Terracing required years of collective effort, stonework, engineering, and maintenance. Through mita, agriculture became a social contract, binding people to the empire. In exchange for labor, the state provided security, stored food in massive warehouses called kolkas, and distributed supplies during droughts, frosts, or crop failures.
These warehouses were marvels of logistical planning. Kolkas lined mountain passes and valleys, each built with ventilation channels to preserve potatoes, maize, quinoa, dried meats, and chuño. The Inca understood that control of food meant control of the realm. A well-fed populace rarely rebelled. Thus, agricultural surplus became the currency of imperial stability, and food storage became as vital as soldiers or fortresses. Elsewhere, in the lands once dominated by the Maya, agricultural innovation persisted even after the collapse of their classic period cities. Maya farmers continued to maintain forest gardens, complex polycultural systems in which dozens of species of fruit trees, medicinal herbs, vines, root crops, and vegetables grew together. It was a living library of biodiversity, carefully pruned and maintained, appearing natural to the untrained eye, but representing centuries of accumulated knowledge. These gardens fed communities long after monumental architecture ceased to rise. Though the Maya political structure had fragmented, their agricultural systems endured. Small-scale irrigation, terracing, swidden cycles, and forest management continued as households and extended families became the custodians of knowledge that had once supported kings and priestly astronomers. Their resilience after political collapse became a testament to the strength of decentralized food systems. Further north, in the lands of the American Southwest, the Hohokam people had built canal networks that rivaled those of ancient Mesopotamia. For over 1,000 years, they diverted rivers into their fields, nurturing cotton, maize, beans, and squash in the arid Sonoran Desert. Their canals were deep, straight, and engineered with mathematical precision to prevent erosion. Although the Hohokam political structure never resembled the hierarchical empires of Mesoamerica or the Andes, their agricultural infrastructure required organized labor and communal governance. Every canal segment had watchers, maintenance teams, water schedulers, and negotiation processes that ensured fairness. Water was life, and the management of water was the management of society. These agricultural systems shaped social classes as well. In many regions, seed keepers held respected roles. Their responsibility was to preserve the diversity of crops by selecting which seeds to store for the next generation. They were observers, healers, storytellers, astronomers. Their work carried deep religious significance. Seed keepers believed they spoke on behalf of plants, listening to what the land needed and adjusting crops accordingly. In the Aztec world, priests presided over rituals that ensured balance between humans and nature. If drought threatened crops, communities held ceremonies where offerings were made to Tlaloc, the rain deity. Meanwhile, in the Andes, priests read coca leaves and watched the skies to determine the right moment for planting. Agriculture was inseparable from spirituality. This worldview helped maintain ecological balance because fields were not just economic assets, they were sacred spaces.
The more these civilizations grew, the more they invested in agricultural experimentation. The Inca established research stations, such as More, a series of concentric terraced depressions resembling a giant amphitheater. Each level had its own temperature, humidity, and soil type, enabling specialists to study how crops responded to different climates. More was a botanical laboratory centuries ahead of its time, where new potato, maize, and quinoa varieties were tested for resilience, yield, and adaptability. Meanwhile, maize continued its evolutionary journey in Mesoamerica. Farmers selectively bred varieties for color, size, texture, flavor, and growing conditions. Some varieties matured quickly, others grew tall and hardy, still others produced softer kernels ideal for grinding. This explosion of diversity was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate human choices. A single plant species became hundreds, each suited to a specific environment. Communities traded seeds across long distances, spreading varieties into new ecological niches. By the time Europeans arrived, maize was already one of the most genetically diverse and widely adapted crops on the planet. Tomatoes, likewise, experienced their transformation in the hands of Mesoamerican farmers. What had once been small, tart berries evolved into plump, juicy fruits of yellow, red, orange, and even purple hues. Chili peppers diversified into hundreds of varieties, from painfully hot to mildly sweet. Beans, too, multiplied in color and shape. The people of the Americas curated diversity, not uniformity. Agriculture increasingly shaped diplomatic relations between regions. Trade routes connected the Gulf Coast with the Central Highlands, the Yucatan Peninsula with Honduras, the Indian valleys with the Amazon Basin. Seeds traveled along with obsidian, ceramics, textiles, and stories. The movement of crops created shared tastes and shared identities. Maize-based cuisines spread southward into northern South America. Potatoes climbed northward into tropical highlands. Manioc traveled east and west, and cacao became a symbol of luxury consumed by elites across Mesoamerica. This interconnected world fostered a sense of mutual dependence. If a drought hit one region, traders from another could supply food. Markets became meeting grounds where agricultural innovation circulated alongside culture and language. But this system also had vulnerabilities. Over-reliance on certain staple crops meant that environmental shifts could cause devastation. Periodic droughts in the Maya lowlands contributed to social upheaval. Frosts in the Andes could wipe out entire potato harvests. Yet the people adapted again and again. They diversified crops, expanded terraces, dug new canals, and shifted planting schedules. Their resilience was rooted in their relationship with the land, a relationship based on reciprocity rather than domination. In the centuries before European arrival, these civilizations reached the height of their agricultural sophistication. Surpluses supported artisans, astronomers, architects, and priests. Food abundance allowed cities to flourish. Festivals celebrated planting and harvest seasons. Agricultural deities received offerings. And everywhere, fields, green, golden, terraced, or floating, irrigated, shaped the horizon.
Food was power, and those who controlled agriculture controlled civilization. Yet none of this power was built through exploitation of nature. Instead, it came from partnership, observation, reference, and innovation. It was a world that saw itself as part of the earth, not above it.
Long before the echo of European footsteps reached the shores of the Americas, the seeds of pre-Columbian innovation had already transformed entire landscapes and shaped civilizations. Yet the most astonishing legacy of these agricultural achievements would only fully unfold after contact. After crops crossed oceans, after empires rose and fell, and after the world's food systems permanently shifted. The transformations that followed were neither simple nor peaceful. They were filled with conflict, adaptation, loss, survival, and reinvention. The arrival of Europeans in the late 15th and early 16th centuries brought shockwaves through the agricultural worlds of the Americas. Diseases unknown to the native populations swept across villages, taking lives before anyone understood what was happening. Yet, alongside devastation came another force, the beginning of global exchange. Crops that had evolved for thousands of years within distinct continental ecosystems suddenly found themselves on ships crossing vast oceans. These were not deliberate exports designed for trade. They were curiosities at first, seeds tucked into the pockets of explorers, samples gathered by botanists, and supplies carried by sailors who had no idea they were transporting the future of global cuisine. Among the first crops to make the voyage was maize. Europeans had never seen anything like it. Wheat, rye, and barley were their staples, and maize, golden, abundant, adaptable, seemed almost unreal. Its height, its broad leaves, its sturdy stalks, and its ability to grow in soils where European grains struggled made it immediately valuable. When maize seeds were planted in Iberian fields, they grew quickly, astonishing farmers. Soon, maize spread across the Mediterranean, where dry climates and poor soils proved no barrier. From Spain, it traveled to Africa, where communities embraced it as an easy-to-grow staple.
In parts of West Africa, maize began replacing millet. In East Africa, it thrived in the highlands of Ethiopia and the interior valleys of Kenya and Tanzania. But maize's journey across the Atlantic did not mirror its place of origin. In the Americas, maize was a sacred crop, planted according to rituals, tied to deities, and accompanied by centuries of agricultural wisdom. In Europe and Africa, it became an anonymous grain, useful, reliable, but stripped of its cultural soul. The deep knowledge of nixtamalization, soaking maize in alkaline solutions to release nutrients, was not carried across with the seeds. As a result, populations in new maize-dependent regions suffered from pellagra, a disease caused by niacin deficiency. Europeans saw maize as food, but did not understand its science. They were cultivating the plant, but not the knowledge that made it truly nourishing. Potatoes experienced a similar journey, though at first Europeans resisted them. The potato, grown by Andean farmers for millennia, had been perfected through thousands of varieties and complex systems of terracing, seed selection, and freeze-drying. Europeans, however, found the plant strange. They distrusted tubers that grew underground and disliked the earthy flavor. For nearly 2 centuries, the potato languished as a botanical curiosity. Even so, its arrival in Europe set into motion a slow transformation. When populations began to understand its reliability, its ability to grow in cold climates, its immunity to many diseases, and its unmatched caloric density, the potato would eventually become a cornerstone of European survival. But this acceptance came later. In the 16th and 17th centuries, it remained mostly confined to gardens and experimental plots.
Yet, unbeknownst to European farmers, the potato carried within it the memory of Andean mountain air, its resilience, its adaptability, its subtle response to temperature changes. These qualities would one day feed populations across Ireland, Russia, Poland, and Northern Europe. But the potato's migration was not immediate. It traveled quietly, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself as one of the world's most important crops. Cacao was different. Europeans fell in love with cacao almost instantly, though they transformed it dramatically. In Mesoamerica, cacao had been sacred, a bridge between the human and divine, consumed in ritual form, infused with spices like chili and flowers like manila, and used as currency. When cacao traveled across the Atlantic, Europeans added sugar and milk, recreating an entirely new drink, one that would eventually give rise to the global chocolate industry. The spiritual significance attached to cacao and its homeland dissolved in the sweetened beverage served in royal courts. Soon, cacao plantations arose across tropical colonies, operated by enslaved labor, severing cacao from the cultural traditions that had cherished it. Tomatoes faced misunderstanding on their journey. Europeans initially believed the plant to be poisonous. Its bright red fruit resembled deadly nightshade, and its leaves smelled unfamiliar. For decades, tomatoes were grown only as ornamental plants in gardens. It was in the Mediterranean, specifically in Italy, where tomatoes finally found acceptance. Local cooks discovered that tomatoes softened beautifully when simmered, releasing rich flavors that merged with herbs, oils, and grains. What the indigenous peoples of the Americas had once used in stews, salsas, and ceremonial dishes now found new expression in sauces, soups, and breads. The tomato changed Italian cuisine so profoundly that many people today mistakenly believe tomatoes originated in Italy. Yet the plant's true homeland lies far across the ocean, tended by indigenous hands long before the first Roman ever tasted it. The movement of American crops into global food systems was not one way. New foods arrived in the Americas as well. Wheat, barley, rice, bananas, citrus fruits, onions, livestock. Some were welcomed, others resisted, and some dramatically transformed landscapes. But the essential truth of this era is this: the world's culinary map became irrevocably intertwined. Crops no longer belonged to isolated regions. They became global, reshaping diets and societies. Yet amid this exchange, indigenous agricultural knowledge risked being lost. Colonization disrupted the systems that had nurtured American crops for thousands of years. Terraces fell into disrepair. Chinampas were drained or abandoned. Traditional seed varieties were replaced with European preferences.
Rituals connected to planting and harvest were suppressed by missionaries who saw them as pagan practices. The agricultural knowledge carried in stories, dances, and oral traditions was threatened by genocidal policies aimed at dismantling indigenous identity.
Despite this, indigenous peoples resisted, not always with armies, but with seeds. They continued cultivating traditional varieties in secret. They maintained ancestral fields hidden beyond colonial settlements. They passed agricultural knowledge to children, even when doing so meant defying colonial law. In remote Andean valleys, farmers continued to grow dozens of potato varieties untouched by European influence. In the forests of Amazonia, communities preserved the complex agroforestry systems their ancestors had developed. In the North American Southwest, Pueblo farmers maintained maize lines with colors and shapes found nowhere else in the world. Even in regions where Europeans imposed new crops and systems, indigenous techniques survived through adaptation. Terracing continued in modified form in parts of Peru and Bolivia. Milpa systems, intercropping maize, beans, and squash, persisted across Central America, offering greater resilience than monoculture farms. Cassava processing techniques remained essential throughout the Caribbean and tropical South America, where detoxification methods were too important to abandon. But survival was only the beginning. Indigenous agricultural knowledge did more than endure. It evolved. Communities that faced catastrophic population losses found new ways to maintain traditions with fewer people. They developed techniques that required less labor or adapted to disrupted landscapes. For example, in regions where colonial livestock destroyed native irrigation channels, farmers shifted toward drought-resistant varieties. In areas where forests were cleared for plantations, indigenous groups began growing crops within the shadows of new landscapes, creating small gardens that blended native and introduced species. As the centuries passed, the world's awareness of American crops deepened. Scholars, botanists, explorers, and later scientists began asking questions the original cultivators had answered long before. Why did maize grow better with beans and squash? Why was nixtamalization essential for nutrition? How could Andean farmers grow crops at elevations where modern agriculture failed? Why were there thousands of potato varieties, each suited to a microclimate? How did Amazonian communities enrich poor soils with charcoal and organic material to create terra preta, dark earth, still unmatched in fertility today? Slowly, a realization emerged. Indigenous agricultural knowledge was not primitive. It was sophisticated, empirical, and scientifically advanced. It represented thousands of years of experimentation and observation. As global science evolved, it found itself arriving at conclusions indigenous farmers had known for centuries. Crop rotation, intercropping, soil amendments, biological pest control, selective breeding, all these ideas had existed long before modern science gave them names. By the 18th and 19th centuries, American crops were feeding millions globally. Maize sustained populations in Africa and Europe. The potato became a cornerstone of nutrition in Northern Europe and Russia. Cassava fed entire regions of Africa with its reliable yields. Tomatoes transformed Mediterranean cuisine. Cacao became a luxury and then an industry. Peanuts spread across Asia, becoming integral to Chinese and Southeast Asian cooking.
Yet, this global success came with consequences. Monoculture farming, unknown in indigenous traditions, spread rapidly. Plantations replaced diverse ecosystems. Cash crops prioritized market value over cultural continuity. The very crops that had emerged from diversity were now grown in uniform rows, robbed of their genetic variation. When diseases struck, as in the Irish potato famine, the vulnerability of monoculture became devastatingly clear. In this era, a new understanding of the past began to emerge. Scientists studying crop diversity turned their gaze to the Americas,
seeking the origins of these global staples. They traveled to Andean mountains, Mexican valleys, Amazonian forests, and Central American highlands to find the ancestral varieties of crops that were now global commodities. Their findings confirmed what indigenous communities had always known. Without diversity, no crop could survive the challenges of climate change, disease, or shifting global conditions. By the late 20th century, agriculturalists around the world acknowledged the indispensable importance of indigenous knowledge. Seed banks worldwide began preserving ancestral varieties. Agroecologists studied milpa systems as models of sustainable agriculture. Researchers documented terracing methods that protected mountain soils. Soil scientists examined terra preta to understand how Amazonian farmers created lasting fertility. Chefs and culinary historians traced cuisines back to the ancient roots they once overlooked. And yet, amid this global recognition, the original cultivators remained the heart of the story. Despite centuries of displacement, appropriation, and exploitation, indigenous communities continued to guard their seeds, their knowledge, and their traditions. In remote valleys, elders taught young farmers how to read the sky and the soil. In forests, women preserved seed baskets passed down through generations. In deserts, Pueblo groups continued ceremonies that honored the spirits of maize. Across the Andes, communities held potato festivals celebrating the diversity their ancestors had protected. The seeds had crossed oceans, reshaped continents, and changed the global food system, but they had never lost their connection to the people who first nurtured them. Even as the world claimed these crops as global treasures, their deepest roots remained firmly grounded in the landscapes and cultures of the Americas. The modern world walks through aisles of supermarkets without realizing that nearly half of the foods displayed there trace their origins to ancient American hands. Hands that shaped seeds long before the words globalization or agriculture existed. What began as humble experiments beside rivers, in mountain terraces, and beneath the shade of tropical forests has become an inheritance that feeds billions. Pre-Columbian agricultural innovations, far from being relics of forgotten civilizations, breathe through every kitchen, every market, every plate that bears the legacy of maize, potatoes, tomatoes, cacao, peanuts, squash, peppers, beans, quinoa, cassava, and so many others. Their legacy is not confined to museums or archaeological sites. It lives within the very structure of human nutrition. The astonishing endurance of these plants reflects not only the brilliance of their early cultivators, but the depth of their relationship with land. These ancient agriculturalists did not set out to conquer nature. They sought to converse with it. Their methods reveal a partnership, a mutual respect between humans and environments so diverse that they forced constant creativity. Today, that creativity echoes in modern agricultural science, although the echoes are often faint and uncredited. As the world faces climate stresses, soil degradation, water shortages, and demographic pressures, the pre-Columbian world presents not nostalgia, but solutions. Consider the Chinampas, the floating fields of the Valley of Mexico. These carefully layered platforms of reeds, mud, sediment, and organic matter produced crops year-round, requiring no chemical fertilizers and wasting no space. In a time when cities expand faster than farmland, and when soil fatigue threatens many regions, the Chinampa offers a model of sustainable urban agriculture. Even now, a small portion of the original Chinampa network survives near Xochimilco. Farmers there demonstrate yields that outperform conventional farmland, even though their methods are ancient. And researchers studying them increasingly see the Chinampa not as a relic, but as a blueprint, one that might guide densely populated cities toward greener futures. Terracing, too, offers a masterclass in agricultural adaptation. The Inca did not simply carve flat levels into mountains. They engineered a system that controlled drainage, prevented erosion, created microclimates, and extended the range of crops across dizzying altitudes. Terraces allowed potatoes,
quinoa, and maize to survive where they otherwise would have perished. Modern conservationists marvel at how these structures endure after centuries of rain, quakes, and time. Engineers note how their stone retaining walls breathe, allowing water to seep but not burst through. Agronomists studying climate change resilience increasingly look toward terracing as a method to stabilize soils in mountainous regions, from Nepal to Ethiopia.
Yet of all pre-Columbian innovations, it is the plants themselves that speak loudest. The sheer diversity of potatoes in the Andes, more than 4,000 varieties, contrasts starkly with the monocultures dominating global agriculture today. Each traditional potato variety carries its own resistance profile: frost tolerance, pest tolerance, drought tolerance, heat tolerance. Every year, Andean farmers plant several varieties side by side, not for novelty, but for survival. This polyculture strategy ensures that if one fails, others survive. In a world increasingly dominated by genetically narrow staples, this ancient diversification holds profound lessons. The same holds true for maize. Indigenous farmers of the Americas developed dozens of land races, each engineered through generations of keen observation. Blue maize, red maize, dent maize, flint maize, popcorn maize, all were cultivated for specific purposes: baking, storage, ritual use, alcohol production, steaming, roasting, feeding animals, and more. But beyond culinary diversity, maize landraces embody genetic wealth, a wealth threatened today by the spread of standardized hybrid varieties. And yet, in remote valleys of Oaxaca, in hidden pockets of the Andes, in the plains of Guatemala, and in the deserts of Arizona, farmers continue to protect these seeds as though they were sacred texts. In truth, they are. Tomatoes, too, tell a story of transformation. What the world knows today, plump, red, sweet tomatoes, were once tiny, tart fruits. It was the growers of Mesoamerica who selected for vibrant color, taste, and pulp. Today, this diversity has been reduced through commercialization, but indigenous farmers and seed-saving networks work tirelessly to protect the older strains. As climate change intensifies, scientists increasingly turn to these forgotten varieties for resilience. Many hold natural resistance to drought, fungal infections, and heat. Resistances bred not by laboratories, but by centuries of Mesoamerican patience. Perhaps no crop more perfectly encapsulates the marriage of culture, spirituality, and agricultural science than cacao. To the Maya and the Mexica, cacao was more than nutrition. It was sacred currency, ritual offering, and medium of social exchange. The carefully shaded agroforestry systems used to cultivate cacao, where it grew beneath taller trees in multi-layered forest gardens, represent some of the earliest examples of sustainable permaculture. Today, cacao agroforestry is celebrated as a powerful tool for preserving biodiversity while supporting rural livelihoods. Yet its origins lie in the ancient Maya lowlands, where farmers mapped forests as carefully as astronomers mapped stars. Cassava, rugged and unassuming, reveals another dimension of human ingenuity. The fact that bitter cassava, laden with natural toxins, became a safe staple food speaks to extraordinary innovation. Through pressing, fermenting, grating, and roasting, communities turned a dangerous root into a dependable source of calories. Today, cassava feeds nearly 1 billion people, particularly in tropical Africa, where it was introduced through transatlantic exchange. Its ability to grow in poor soils, resist drought, and tolerate heat has made it indispensable. And as the planet warms, cassava's importance may only grow.
These ancient innovations were not isolated triumphs. They were interwoven into community systems. Seed keepers, farmers, herbalists, astronomers, and storytellers all played roles in maintaining agricultural knowledge. Stories preserved seed lore. Rituals ensured the continuity of planting cycles. Communal fields distributed risk. Knowledge flowed freely across generations, encoded not in written documents, but in hands, in memories, in ceremonies, and in the landscapes themselves. But the arrival of Europeans shattered this world. Diseases introduced from across the Atlantic decimated populations. Fields were abandoned, traditions interrupted, empires collapsed. And yet, remarkably, despite the upheaval, the seeds endured. Maize crossed oceans,
Potatoes traveled to Europe and became staple crops. Tomatoes conquered Italian cuisine. Peanuts and chili peppers spread across Asia. Cacao transformed global tastes. Cassava fed continents. Quinoa, once ignored by Europeans, surged to international acclaim centuries later. The plant survived because no empire could kill what was already embedded in the soil of the world, in the hunger of humanity, and the continuous need for nourishment. Today, scientists increasingly acknowledge that the future of agriculture may depend on the past. Ancient American crop varieties hold traits that modern breeders desperately need: drought resistance, salt tolerance, pest resilience, nutritional density, and adaptability. Researchers studying maize now turn to indigenous land races to understand how they thrive at high altitudes, low rainfall zones, or extreme heat. Climate-resilient potatoes, preserved for centuries in mountain villages, are now part of global survival strategies. Wild relatives of squash, beans, and tomatoes, protected by indigenous communities, hold genetic tools essential for the next century of food security. But the acknowledgement of the scientific value is only the first step. The deeper legacy lies in worldview. Pre-Columbian agricultural systems thrived not because they bent nature to human will, but because they understood nature's rhythms intimately. Modern agriculture often seeks domination, monocultures, chemicals, extraction. Ancient systems sought reciprocity. They worked with rivers, not against them. They built terraces that stabilized mountains instead of leveling them. They planted forests rather than clearing them. They cultivated diversity because diversity ensured survival. They honored the land because they depended on it completely. The resurgence of interest in regenerative agriculture mirrors many of these ancient ideas. Farmers across the world now experiment with intercropping, agroforestry, terracing, soil building, and water-conserving systems. Ecologists study nutrient cycles used by Maya milpa farms, rotations of maize, beans, and squash that enriched soil naturally. Urban planners examine Chinampa-style floating gardens for modern wetlands. And sustainability experts attempt to integrate indigenous principles into conservation programs. Yet true progress will require more than borrowing methods. It will require honoring the knowledge keepers who preserved these systems through centuries of marginalization.
Indigenous communities today continue to steward vast genetic libraries of crops. Their fields are living museums of diversity, their rituals encoded calendars of climate, their stories maps of ecological memory. To secure the future of global food systems, their leadership is not optional, it is essential. The legacy of pre-Columbian agriculture is not simply a gift from the past. It is a responsibility carried by present and future generations. As this final chapter draws to a close, one truth becomes unmistakable. The foods that sustain the modern world exist because ancient cultivators listened to land, to water, to wind, to plants. They crafted civilizations not with conquest, but with patience. Their innovations endure not because they were powerful, but because they were wise. And in a time when the planet faces unprecedented challenges, their wisdom may yet be what saves us. The story of pre-Columbian agricultural innovation is not merely history. It is a living legacy, a seed planted thousands of years ago that continues to grow, nourish, and guide humanity. The future of food may well depend on how well we nurture this ancient seed, how deeply we respect the land that gave it life, and how faithfully we honor the people whose quiet genius shaped the world's appetite.
The adventure continues. The past speaks, the future listens, and together we explore. Don't let this be the end. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and come with us on the next adventure through time and knowledge.